Welcome to Wednesday and Victory's virtual workshop, where we create confidence and clarity for your financial life. I'm Patrick Huey, and today is March 27th, 2024. Today, we're going to tackle what you need to know about investing in 2024, which, in case you haven't heard, is an election year. Now, my goal today is not to create political arguments, because remember, that's what Facebook and Thanksgiving are for. We're live again this week, so feel free to post in the chat using the button I've highlighted here, or if you prefer, you can message me separately via email or text, and I've included that information on the slide as well. So here's what we'll talk about today. As far as the 2024 election, the landscape, policy implications, and how to invest in an election year. Now, you may have heard President Biden and former President Trump have both clinched the nominations for the Democratic and Republican parties, respectively. Now, that means that 2020 and 2024 are similar years in many, many ways. And you may have seen some memes about this on social media if you're into that sort of thing. But they're both leap years. They both featured the same teams in the Super Bowl. Both had the same Super Bowl winner. Billie Eilish won Song of the Year in both years. And now we will likely have the same candidates for the presidential election. Can you say Back to the Future? Okay, key election dates. It's still primary season, which extends through June, even though both candidates have clinched. And that's going to be followed by party conventions during the summer. Each candidate is then officially nominated at these conventions, and usually the running mate is established, and the party talks about its platform. Balloons drop, and everybody hugs it out at the end. Now, campaigning will then continue throughout the summer, and it'll heat up next fall, potentially with presidential debates. And then it will culminate with the general election on Tuesday, November 5th. So the perpetual campaign season is ongoing. It continues, and it will go through November and perhaps beyond. Where are we currently? Well, let's talk about the Electoral College. There are 538 Electoral College votes available, and it requires 270 to win the presidency. In 2020, President Biden earned 306 votes, and former President Trump earned 232 votes. The Republican candidate would need to pick up 38 votes this time around relative to 2020. In the Senate currently consists of 48 Democrats, 49 Republicans, and 3 independents that caucus or vote with the Democrats. And the Republicans need just 2 seats to control the Senate, or just 1 if they also win the House. In that House of Representatives, there are currently 221 Republicans, 213 Democrats, and 3 vacant seats. Democrats would need to win 5 seats to take control of the House. So you can see it's very close in both the houses of Congress, and probably a fairly close presidential election as well. For better or for worse, only a few states typically determine the presidency. In 2020, President Biden won 306 Electoral College votes, the same number that President Trump won in 2016. And although that appears to be a comfortable margin of 36 electoral votes, it's basically 3 states. Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin would account for 37 votes. And back then in 2020, it was a matter of 43,000 individual votes turned all 3 of those states. So the potential to be a nail biter is there again. Several races were called days after the election, and 5 races had less than a 2% spread of votes between candidates. Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania all won by Biden, and North Carolina won by Trump. So close contests in those states amongst the Electoral College. would lead there to be a delay in announcing a winner past election night. So those states, Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, along with Nevada, Michigan, and Florida, will likely determine the next president of the United States, as I said, for better, for worse. Democrats are risking losing the Senate if they can't hold the toss-up states. Now, every 2 years, about 1/3 of the Senate is up for election as senators serve staggered 6-year terms. And in 2024, there's 34 seats that are up for election. 23 are currently held by Democrats, and 11 are held by Republicans. According to the Cook Political Report, there are 3 toss-up states, all currently held by Democrats. Arizona, held by Kristen Sinema, who I believe has announced she's not going to run again, and Ohio, held by Sherrod Brown. And then there's Montana, held by Jon Tester. Democratic Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia will not run again as well, so that seat is very likely to flip potentially to the Republican Party. And there's just not much ground for Democrats to gain this time around in the cycle, so they are at risk of losing their slim majority in the Senate. Battle for control of the House is going to be a tight one. All 435 seats in the House of Representatives are up for election every 2 years, and the Democrats would need to win just 5 seats to regain control there. So that's the landscape. What are the implications for policy? Well, let's take a look at fiscal policy. That's likely to be the key issue that people cite during this election, especially when they're talking about why they're doing this or that with their investments. In the long run, it is, or it should be, policy, not politics, that matters the most for the economy and markets. And both candidates have proposed various policies they'd like to enact. Again, it's early in this game, and we probably won't get much in the way of details until the summer, when both parties have their soirees and announce what their platforms will be. But one item that must be decided on during the next administration is whether to extend or sunset a lot of the key provisions from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That was the change in the federal tax code that lowered tax rates for a lot of Americans. It redid essentially the entire tax code, including deductions and tax brackets. And federal finances are already deeply unbalanced. We've talked about it here in this forum before, but the 2024 federal deficit alone is estimated at $6.5 trillion, with $870 billion going to net interest payments. Now, you combine that with what is already a fairly large deficit at $34 trillion and counting, we're looking at some fairly daunting numbers, and I don't care what party you are, those numbers should get your attention. Over the next decade, the budget deficit is set to remain between 5 and 7% of GDP, which is historically high, and is going to have to be financed at higher interest rates, possibly 3 to 5% going forward. So an increasing slice of the deficit will go to net interest payments, which is unlikely to boost economic growth. Indeed, by the 2040s, the late 2040s, those interest payments could end up being the largest federal program in the budget, surpassing Social Security and Medicare. Now, this is likely to send the U.S. debt to GDP ratio well above 100% over the next decade. We're looking at 120% by 2033. That means that our debt will be higher than their gross domestic product annually for the first time ever, including World War II. And this does not include the impact of a possible extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act past the end of 2025, which it is estimated would raise the deficit another $2.6 trillion. From a market perspective, this could drive bond yields higher. You may already be seeing some of that baked into higher bond yields. And regardless of the election outcome, neither party's likely to reduce the deficit from the trajectory it's on. And I would say neither party is super interested in extending those Tax Cuts and Jobs Act tax rates either. Now, they may be saying they will. In fact, I've seen quotes from both sides of the aisle saying we'd like to extend those tax brackets past the end of 2025, but that's more than likely early on election pandering from both of those parties. It's just not fiscally feasible to continue on this level of debt with our current tax rates. So other than fiscal, let's look at what the Fed is doing as far as its policy and what the policies could look like in 2024 as an election year. Historically, the Fed does not sit on the sidelines during election years. Yes, it's supposed to be impartial, but history shows that they continue to pursue their dual mandate of price stability and maximum employment while maintaining its, and I'm going to air quote it, independence from politics. Since 1980, the Fed has either hiked or cut rates in every single election year except 2012, when rates were essentially at zero already, and the economy was still healing from the financial crisis. Otherwise, the Fed cut rates in 5 election years, and they hiked in 5 election years. I don't expect them to hike in 2024, but at some point we will probably see some cuts in rates as long as inflation is accommodative to that. And I wouldn't be surprised if those cuts came closer to election day versus farther away. Call me a cynic, but that's just the way I see things. Okay, last up, investing in an election year. What can we do to make sure that we are optimizing our investments in what could be a fairly volatile year? Well, political opinions are best expressed at the polls and not in a portfolio. Okay, this chart shows a survey from the Pew Research Center asking Americans how they feel about economic conditions. And the results show that Republicans often feel better about the economy under a Republican president, while similarly, Democrats often feel better about the economy under a Democratic president. Well, duh. I mean, this is an example of confirmation bias. You will look for information confirming your bias, and you will ignore what goes against it. And if your team is the Republicans, you're going to naturally feel better because you're finding information that confirms your bias that, hey, things are pretty good. If your team is the Democrats, you're going to do likewise. It's natural. It's part of the human brain. So don't feel badly about it and don't hold it against other people. Just realize that it does happen. And this is completely diametrically opposed to what actually happens, by the way. Average annual returns on the S&P 500 during the Obama administration were 16.3%. And during the Trump administration, they were 16%, almost identical. And they were higher than the average return over the last 30 years of 10.4%. And yet, Republicans felt better under the Trump administration, and Democrats felt better under the Obama administration economically. So what we're trying to say here is don't allow your political opinions to cloud your investment judgment. Investors who allowed their political opinions to overrule their investing discipline, they may have missed out on above average returns during political administrations that they didn't like. Hating or loving the government is not an investment strategy. Investors considering waiting until their man or woman from their preferred political party occupies the White House should recognize how that would have worked out in the past. A $10,000 investment held in the Dow Jones Industrial Average from 1896 to 2018 would now be worth over $6 million. But if you incorporated a strategy where you only own stocks whenever your party's in the White House and sell whenever the other party is in the White House, you'd be worth roughly $5 million less. But wouldn't we all be better off if the political parties were more cooperative and compromising and could get more accomplished? Come on, can't we just work across the aisle? Well, not necessarily. Historically, the markets have done very well when there has been divided government and quote unquote gridlock. Whereas when one party dominates both branches, the returns have been slightly lower. You've heard us say it before, but we'll say it again. Past performance indicates little about future results. Investors always want to know how markets performed under different configurations of government or different years of a presidency. But these returns actually tell us very little about how markets are likely to perform in the future. Okay, we just looked at the numbers, but how do we know what's going to happen in 2024? We don't. In actuality, monetary policy, fiscal policy, economic growth, labor markets, corporate profits, and valuations are much better indications of future results. Okay, the economic context, not just the political context, tends to be much more relevant to understand historical market environments and returns. Returns tend to be lower and volatility tends to be higher during election years because of uncertainty. Markets hate uncertainty. And uncertainty, unfortunately, is at an all-time high with this election as well as the last two. However, averages don't tell the full story, as recent presidential elections have been particularly volatile with historic market drawdowns. If you remember 2000, there was a sell-off related to the bursting of the tech bubble. 2008 was the onset of the financial crisis, and 2020 was COVID. 2020 experienced a sharp correction and then a strong rebound, both completely unrelated to the election. Markets do not like uncertainty, like we just said, and elections foment uncertainty. Typically, in the lead up to an election, markets face headwinds because of that uncertainty. But usually, once the winner is known, once things have clarified, regardless of the result, markets tend to move on and focus on the fundamentals. In almost every presidential election since 1980, markets moved higher after Election Day. Now, a lot of people argue that the economy and markets perform better under one party or another, but over the long term, they both tend to fare pretty well under a variety of configurations of government. The most common configuration of government is divided, meaning not one party doesn't control both the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And that's produced 2.7% annualized real gross domestic product growth since World War II, and an 8.3% annualized return on the S&P 500. Not bad. And the odds are still highly in favor of this particular outcome happening again. Odds are we'll see some type of divided government after November. If you want more on investing in an election year, send me a message. I'll send you a digital copy of this report on election uncertainty. Don't let the election rattle your retirement outlook. It's complimentary, so just let me know where to send it, and it's all yours. That's it for today. Thanks for being with me. Be on the lookout in the weekly briefing email for the next topic for our virtual workshop. Thanks, everybody, and I'll see you next week.